Hello, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we continue our look at Marvel Champions with a guide to defeating the barbershop quartet that is the Wrecking Crew. We'll give you the ins and outs and ups and downs of what to expect and how to overcome this festival of villainy. First things first though, spoiler alert. I repeat, do not tread further should you wish to experience yourself all that the crew has to offer. With that over, let's summarise who the Wrecking Crew are and what they bring to the table. Well, the obvious thing to point out is that you're not facing one villain. You're staring down the barrel of four big dudes all at once. Wrecker Willie, Thunderball Timmy, Piledriver Pete and Bulldozer Billy. Thank Donald Duck then that only one of them activates each turn. You see, each one has a side scheme that gets one threat added to it each turn as a gift from the main scheme. It's then the side scheme with the most threat on it that determines who activates that turn. Whilst each villain brings something different to the table, they also have some similarities. Each have 15 card encounter decks and include some staples across them all. Held Hostage, Get Wrecked and Buddy System all try and throw a curveball at the predictability of who's going to activate next. Corrupt Prison Guard and Escaped Convict are your only minion distractions throughout the encounter, and Chaos in the Prison and I've Been Waiting for This, which are only found in 3 of the 4 decks, add to the consistency in theme. Another tidbit to note is that the side schemes that start with the most threat also accompany the villains with the most hit points, with Wrecker at the top with 6 threat and 14 hit points, down to Piledriver with 3 threat and 11 hit points. In other words, it's the most durable villains that will likely be activating first in the early turns. A conscious, balancing decision, but something to consider when tackling the problem at hand. So let's go through what each crew member brings to the table and how and in which order you might want to tackle them. First up is Wrecker, a purple masked fiend that does not like it one bit when you don't defend against his attacks. Having the most hit points of the WC, he is ever slightly the most durable, and his side scheme, which starts with the highest threat, is either very strong if you're high on allies, which you'll often find with the leadership aspect, or quite negligible if it's just heroes at the table. His signature attachments, Magic Crowbar and Wrecker's Command, can both be worked around, but the former definitely makes Wrecker even more potent if you're sticking in hero form. 2 copies of Crowbar Toss, Mystical Link and Your Dead Meat are his signature treachery cards, bringing some further unpredictability, a ramp up in threat and a low risk, high consequence amount of chip damage. Wrecker doesn't pack too many boost icons in his encounter deck and an average number of star icons, most of which do extra damage or move the active counter, so don't worry too much about burst amounts of scheming and damage so long as you're defending. Wrecker is the biggest problem for front foot identities that always like to attack or those that don't have allies to defend for them. Protection aspects will have no problem whatsoever with him. Leadership will have little trouble with the villain, but a lot of trouble with the side scheme activating. Prioritise his disposal only if you're ally heavy. Otherwise keep the active counter away from him as much as possible and deal with him near the end. Next up is Thunderball, a schemer at heart but one that's more than happy to spread that damage around should you face him in hero form, and whose side scheme is more of a delaying tactic than anything else. His signature attachments, Ball and Chain and Radioactive Build-Up both look to shore up his weak base attack, so every so often Thunderball will surprise you with his damage output. 2 copies of the signature treacheries, Energy Projectiles, Lightning Blast and Tactical Prowess bring a variety of outcomes, with their most likely consequence being a side scheme going off prematurely. Thunderball does bring a good amount of boost icons and an average amount of star icons that don't do anything that you won't see frequently throughout your dealings with the Wrecking Crew. In most situations, Thunderball doesn't pose the greatest danger to your party, Obviously, the more time you spend in alter ego form, the more punishing he becomes. But a good justice build can negate a lot of the villain's scheming. Just be mindful, if you're an ally heavy build, that his force response area effect damage can soon mount up. Piledriver is next on the list, a red masked prickly pear who is just begging to be dealt high amounts of damage in short order. The retaliate ability, which can be worked around, the lowest health pool, and a side scheme that can be punishing but is still ultimately situational, mean that he is in a vacuum the least troublesome of all the crew, but the most tempting to deal with first. His signature attachment slots are taken up by distracting taunts, and the not so attachment, uncanny resilience. Neither of which are particularly punishing. You kind of just say sure thing, I'll punch you in the face with the former, and the latter is unlikely to cause too much stress. His signature treacheries, escape plan, oversized hands and pummel are all about applying status cards to hinder your progress, discarding support cards and doing vanilla boosty things. He packs a fairly pitiful suite of boost icons, so don't be sweating on taking on too much threat or an attack that you can't cope with. Although he does have an above average number of star icons to contend with, most of which complement the theme we've already talked about. All in all, Piledriver doesn't pack too much of a threat, especially with his low health pool, but beware if your identity has particularly potent supports and upgrades. Best at dealing with him will generally be aggression builds that can take him out in 2 or 3 hits if you're playing solo, but contrastly, protection with their propensity towards chip damage will have a bit of a harder time. Last but not least is Bulldozer, a punch first, scheme later type of villain with a combat ability that encourages your hero to defend and tank the damage, and a side scheme that at first might seem strong. Milling a quarter of your deck though is only bad if you're particularly unlucky when you've been searching for a particular card. His signature attachments, Bulldozer's helmet and ramming speed perfectly complement his playstyle, meaning if you're sticking around in hero form you'll be forced to absorb a healthy amount of damage. On the treachery side of things, Bull Rush, Headbutt and Leading the Charge somewhat surprisingly centre around milling from your hand and deck, echoing his side scheme. But again, unless you're particularly unlucky, you can deal with these speed bumps as they occur. Bulldozer packs the most amount of boost icons of all the crew, with very little in the way of star icons, accentuating his fairly straightforward approach to wrecking, but also sending the message that if you're thinking of hiding in alter ego form against him, you'll still be facing some particularly potent scheming. Bulldozer is someone I would often look to be dealing with early. He's lined up to be the third villain to attack, so you do have a bit of breathing room if you're prepared to take the risk that the myriad ways that the threat order can change don't come up. But whatever you do, don't take your eyes off him. Protection is certainly a good counter, as is aggression. Both take different but equally efficient approaches to dealing with him. Their heroic versions all get a 3 hit point per player buff and a stat increase. Wrecker is the recipient of the greatest upgrade, gaining both 1 scheme and 1 attack. Thunderball gets his weak attack buff by 1. Piledriver gets 1 extra attack, making him more of a threat in hero form, and contrastly, Bulldozer has his weak scheme topped up by 1. What this means is that the increased challenge in heroic is linear. There is no expert set of cards added. You can just pick and choose who you want to upgrade for a greater challenge. If you want to do it incrementally, consider upgrading Bulldozer first, then Piledriver, Thunderball and finally Wrecker. You may have noticed I've not mentioned much of the justice aspect. The main reason for that is that the main scheme is fairly trivial to keep on top of, and the side schemes rarely act as a hard timer for the scenario's outcome. That's not to say that the thwart favouring justice aspect is redundant, not at all, but you might want to consider tuning your build to ensure a little bit more damage output. And note as well that there are hard counter hero builds and ways to cheese most scenarios, and the WC is no different. Alas, that won't be a point of discussion today. Your friend Google can help you there. So now that we've gone through the playstyles of each member, let's leave you with some parting tips. Firstly, if you're trying to map out which villain is most likely to move the active counter, consider that Thunderball will often pile threat on a side scheme that already has the most, likely triggering a scheme's forced response. On the other end of the spectrum, Wrecker is most likely to both support and activate the side scheme with the least threat. And then both Pole Driver and Bulldozer stay relatively on the fence, but will more often than not favour the least threat as well. Due to the bending of the usual one villain pattern of setup, this scenario does ramp in difficulty to an even greater degree. The more players there are, the more you draw encounter cards, and so the more unpredictable the active counter will be, making mitigation and game planning that little harder. Thankfully, the standard version of the Wrecking Crew is not as difficult as some other villains released to date, allowing you to scale the difficulty quite well to player count. That's it for this guide though. I do hope you found it helpful. Let me know in the comments how you've been enjoying playing the Wrecking Crew, and I'll see you next time.